Welcome back to Discovery, your final session of Discovery. This is the 9th session. So yeah, you've been here all the way through, and well done for getting to the end. I hope you've enjoyed the previous sessions, and I think you'll really enjoy the session today. So today we've got Rosemary, who is going to talk you through psychology. So over to you, Rosemary.
Hi everyone. Okay, I'll just start by sharing my screen, just so you can see my slides. Okay, that should be full screen now. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit. Firstly, I'm just going to talk a bit about psychology and what it is and what it's like to study psychology at university, because I don't know how many of you have already studied psychology, and it might not be something that you have the opportunity to study already at GCSE. Actually, if any of you already study psychology, it would be great if you could use the thumbs up reaction to show me. I don't think that's anyone there. But and if anybody's thinking of studying psychology at university, maybe do the love heart. Are any of you thinking of studying psychology? I think maybe a couple there. Okay, so just to start off, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what psychology is. So there are quite a few misconceptions about what psychology is. Some people think that if you study psychology, you're immediately going to be trained to be a counsellor, or you're only going to work with people who have mental health conditions, or that you're going to be reading people's minds and studying their dreams. As that question happens to me, it comes up to me all the time. People are always asking me, so what am I thinking? And that's obviously not what psychology is about. So I thought I'd just talk a tiny little bit about what it is to study psychology at university, and then we can go on to our example lecture. So psychology is a science. That's one of the most important things. And sometimes you might be studying the brain. You might be doing some of these kind of studies where you look at how people's brains react when they do different tasks. But it's not just that. You might be working with children. You might be working with young adults or teenagers. There's a lot of writing, there's lots of essay writing, but there's a lot of statistics as well. So it's a very maths-based subject. And there are so many different areas of psychology. So here is just some of the basic branches of psychology. So we've got kind of this behavioral psychology. So we study how people react in different situations. Cognitive, so how their brains work. Biological is really looking into how different areas of the brain react when people do different tasks and the chemicals that are involved with that. Developmental just means studying how people develop. So I do developmental psychology myself. So I work with young children at preschool, but there's lots of different branches there. Evolutionary, so how people evolve over time. Personality, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And social psychology, so how people react in different social situations. And there are many things that you can move on to do. Lots of people might think that they want to go on to do something like counselling or clinical psychology, but you have to get more qualifications after studying it at university in order to do that. But anyway, so if you have any questions at the end about studying psychology at university, I'd be very happy to answer those questions. But I thought I'd just talk a little bit about it to start with, as maybe it's not something you have the opportunity to study yet. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about personality and what personality is. So first off, we're just going to start with this definition here. So this is a definition from the American Psychological Association. So what is personality? So personality refers to the enduring characteristics and behavior that comprise a person's unique adjustment to life. So when we say life here, we're talking about your experiences, the world around you, including major traits, interests, drives, values, self-concept, abilities, and emotional patterns. So what we're talking about here really are those traits that you have across different situations. We're not talking about your skills. So if you're good at football, that isn't really your personality, that's a skill. And we've got some interesting words here, I think. So we've got this enduring characteristics here. So these are characteristics that you have across different situations that last for a long time. But we'll talk a little bit more about whether these characteristics stay the same for your whole life or whether there are changes in your personality. A person's unique adjustment to life, so that is different for each person. And when we talk about life here, as I said, we're talking about kind of the environment that you live in, the experiences that you have. And there are lots of different things that we could look at, different ways that we could measure personality, but today we're going to focus particularly on traits, so different personality traits. So a trait could be something like being a kind person, or being a hardworking person, or being an anxious person. These are all different types of traits. So this is what psychologists are talking about when they use this term personality. And there are lots of different theories of personality. If you study psychology at A level or at university, you'll learn a little bit more about the different types of theories of personality. But today we're going to focus a lot on a trait-based personality approach, and particularly there's this approach called the Big Five personality traits. So I think I gave you a task just to have a look at these big traits beforehand and do your own personality test. But these Big Five personality traits that we talk about are agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness, so openness to experience. We'll talk a little bit more about what each of these words mean. But what we mean when we talk about these traits, these aren't something that you have or that are optional. They're not something that you have or you don't have. When we talk about these traits, we have this idea that every human being falls somewhere on a spectrum from very agreeable to not agreeable at all, and from very conscientious to not conscientious at all. So we each fall somewhere on a continuum from a high amount of this trait to a low amount of this trait. And this framework is really commonly used across lots of studies. It's been found that these traits kind of group together in a similar way across different cultures, even though people in different cultures may some cultures people may be more extroverted than others. Some cultures people may be more agreeable, conscientious, or whichever of these traits than others. But across different cultures, different features of people's personality seem to group together into these traits. So it's a very commonly used way that psychologists look at personality. And how do we examine these big five personality traits? So often we use adjectives. So you might have a scale where you go from something like I am, like which of these words applies to, actually that's, oh sorry, which of these words applies the most to you, or which of these sentences applies the most to you. So you might have a sentence like, I see myself as a person who is reserved. You can say how much you think this word applies to you, or generally has confidence in others. And each of these items will link to one of those different big five personality traits. And just coming back to this slide here, what we can see here at the top of the screen, we've got some words that might be associated with somebody who's high in one of these traits. And at the bottom of the screen, we've got words that are associated with people who are low in these traits. And the important thing with all of these traits is that even though it may seem like it's better to be high in a trait or low in a trait, all of them, there are pros and cons to being high or low in all of these traits. None of them are good traits or bad traits. So neuroticism, if you're high in neuroticism, you might be prone to kind of depression. You might be a very emotional person. You might be anxious. You might be shameful. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're low in neuroticism, you might not be afraid of things, which might allow you to go on to do more. But you might not feel shame as well, which might lead you to be maybe to put yourself in danger. And then we've got extroversion, which I think is a trait that we often think about. So how much do you like being with other people? We often talk about it as how much, if you're with other people, does it make you feel like you're recharging? Do you need to be with other people to recharge, or do you prefer to be by yourself to recharge? And again, they can be positives on either end of the spectrum. Then openness to experience. So some of the words associated here are magical thinking. So kind of creativity, imagination are links to openness to experience, that kind of willingness to go out and experience the world. And on the other side of the spectrum, you might have people who prefer to stay at home, people who maybe are a bit less flexible in their thinking, a bit less creative, but this might make them better at some other things. Then we've got agreeableness, which it might seem obvious to us that agreeable seems to be a positive trait, but actually people who are high in agreeableness might be too trusting, they might be gullible, they might not think of themselves. And on the other end of the spectrum, you might have some of these negative traits like deceitfulness, being manipulative, callous. But you also might have people that look out for themselves. Sometimes being selfish might be a good thing. And finally, conscientiousness. So this is kind of working hard. So people who are high in this trait might be kind of very hardworking. They might be perfectionists. And people who are low in this trait might not take a lot of responsibility in their work. They might be more distractible. They might not be as hardworking and in the things that they do. And what we see is, so here we've got lots of different cultures here, and we can see that there's a lot of variation in how people in the extent to which people have these traits across different cultures. So you can see that, so in Western Europe, where we are, the most people often report that they are high in kind of openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And they maybe report that they're lower in neuroticism, which is generally reported across most cultures, but there's a lot of variation there. I won't go into the differences in detail right now. And yes, as I mentioned, we often report, so how do we measure this personality? There are different ways of measuring personality, but most commonly when we talk about these traits, we use questionnaires, and it might be that you have to report how much you think you're similar to an adjective, like hardworking or creative or imaginative, or it might be sentences like we've got here. How much do you agree with these sentences, which I think is what I asked you to do in that task. There was an online test to see where you fall on each of these measures. But there might be some problems with using these questionnaires. If we're reporting about ourselves, we might have a certain idea that we're wanting to portray. Maybe we think that it's a good thing to be agreeable. We think it's a good thing to be conscientious. And therefore we might report that we're more agreeable or more conscientious than maybe we really are. But on the other hand, if others report on, we can ask other people to report on our personality. So we could ask people's parents, people's siblings, people's friends to report on their personality. But do they really know what someone's personality is? They only have a specific experience of that person. And what you can see here is, I think this is a really interesting graph. This is a study where they got they asked lots of teenagers to report on their own personality, and they asked their mothers, their fathers, and their siblings to also report on their personality. And what you can see, so this is agreeableness. And I think I don't know if anybody here has a sibling, but I think it's not super surprising that siblings report that their sibling has lower agreeableness than the person themselves or their mothers or fathers. So you can see that we might want to think a little bit about how we're measuring it and whether who's reporting on personality, because they might have different ideas, they might have different experiences of a person, and it's difficult to know who is the most accurate here, because each person has a different experience of somebody's personality. There are lots of different facets to it. So one way that we can look at so why are we interested in personality? So one thing that we can look at is whether your personality traits are related to other outcomes in your life. So this is a really interesting study. So what they did in this study, the researchers asked parents and children and adolescents to complete personality questionnaires on the big 5 traits. So we mentioned agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness to experience. And then at age 29, they asked the same people to report on all of these different life outcomes: how much money they were earning, what they achieved at school, how satisfied they were in their relationships, their attachment to their partners, and emotional symptoms like depression. And I don't know, does everybody have access to the chat? I would love it if some of you could make some predictions, just thinking about any specific combination of these. What do you think? Do you think, if you look at these different traits here, what do you think might be related to the life outcomes at age 29? So do you think maybe that people who are more agreeable at age 12 might have higher income or achieve better at school? I'll see if anybody wants to write what they think in the chat, if they've got any predictions there. I'll see if anybody. So maybe thinking about any specific ones of these, and then we'll have a look at what they did find in the study. Sorry, I haven't got any right now, but okay, we'll move on and have a look at what they did find in the study, but maybe just have a think about that yourself. So think about what you might predict here. Do you think that maybe people who are more agreeable, more conscientious, more extroverted might have a higher income? Or oh yes, we've got some answers here. So if somebody has said they think conscientiousness will lead to educational achievement and also income. That's an interesting one. We've got a couple of people saying that. Somebody has said openness to experience might lead to more educational achievement. Oh, an interesting one here from somebody. Extroversion could lead to a lack of relationship satisfaction, but as they might expect an unrealistic amount of attention from their partner. That's an interesting one. Agreeableness might result in higher attachment. Agreeableness linked to income. So we've got lots of interesting ideas here. So let's have a look at what they actually found in this study. So people who had higher openness to experience at age 12, as reported by their parents, but not as reported by themselves. There were no significant findings for what they reported themselves, how they reported their own openness to experience. So if your parents say that you're more open to experience at age 12, these children went on to have higher income at age 29 and higher achievement at school. Then we've got children who were more conscientious at age 12. If they reported themselves that they were more conscientious at age 12, interestingly, they went on to have lower educational achievement than people who reported that they were less conscientious at age 12, which is interesting. It's maybe not what we would have expected. And then, but if your parents report that you're more conscientious at age 12, then you go on to have higher educational achievement. So we've got a bit of a contrast there. It's interesting. I don't know if anyone's got any ideas why that might be the case. If you've got ideas, you'll feel free to write them in the chat, because it's a really interesting. It's not maybe what you would expect. So children who are more agreeable at age 12, as reported by themselves, had higher relationship satisfaction at age 29 and more secure attachment to their partners, which I think we had a couple of people predicting that, which maybe isn't so surprising. And if you report that yourself that you're more extroverted at age 12, then you're less likely to be depressed at age 29, which maybe isn't something that we thought of, but I'm not sure why that might be. And if you report that you're more neurotic, so maybe more anxious, more emotional at age 12, you might be more likely to be depressed at age 29 and have less secure attachment to your partners. But if your parents report that you're more neurotic at age 12, so more anxious, then you go on there was the and late at age 29, they were more likely to have lower educational achievement and lower work income. So what I think is really interesting about this study, I think there are two things that are really interesting here. Firstly, the findings are very different for what people report their own personality to be and what people's parents report their personality to be. It seems that what our parents think we are seems to be better at predicting educational achievement and work and income at work. But what we think ourselves to be maybe is better at predicting emotional symptoms and relationships, which I think is really interesting. What we can find here as well is maybe it's surprising that what a personality is at age 12 might predict all of these things. Maybe it's a little bit surprising that we've got so many of these associations were significant. But of course, this is just statistics over a big group of participants. I think there were thousands of teenagers who took part in this study. So it doesn't mean anything for any individual. If you got a high score and extroversion, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're less likely to be depressed. Or if you got a higher openness score, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a higher work income. It just over a big group of people, this is what they found. So I think it's really interesting for us to have a look at what causes these differences. So maybe somebody has asked, do you know how many people were in the study? And I can't remember, but I've got the name of the author here. So it was Luan et al. 2017, that's in the corner of the screen there, and I can find out for you. And so now let's talk a little bit about what causes these differences in personality. So there are lots of different things that might cause us to have differences in personality. So there are there's our genetic makeup. So kind of the genetics that come to us from our parents, and we've also got the environment that we grow up in, and it may be a mix of the two. So I think, well, let's just talk a little bit about heritability. So I don't know, maybe this is something that you've studied in biology, but so heritability is this idea of how much of a trait is accounted for by your genes. So if a trait is highly heritable, that means that nearly all of the variation in that trait is accounted for by your genes. So for instance, your eye color, your hair color, your skin color are all very heritable traits, almost 100% heritable. And we've got another example here. So height is about 80% heritable. So most of the variation in your height comes from your genetics, but it's an interaction between your genetics and your environment. So you might have this potential to be a certain height, but if your environment doesn't provide you with if you don't get enough food, or if you don't have certain experiences in life, you might not reach that potential height. And another example here, something that is 0% heritable, is the language that you speak. Of course, you may share the language that you speak with your family, but it's not a genetic, it's all related to the environment you grow up in. If you grow up in an English-speaking household, you'll speak English. And if you grow up in a French-speaking household, you'll speak French. There's nothing genetic about it. So personality is an interesting one. Because you can make good arguments for it being caused by genetics. There's people are often very similar to their family, to their siblings, their parents, but you can also make a good argument for it being caused by the environment that you grow up in. So, but it's quite a difficult one to tear apart. Somebody's found out the answer there. So there were 186 adolescents, 53% were boys in that previous study. Thank you to the person who's looked that up. So, sorry, just coming back to this question of nature versus nurture. So this is something that we hear a lot in psychology. It's a really big debate in lots of different areas of psychology, and there's definitely a big debate in personality psychology as well. So how much of your personality is caused by your genetics, and how much is caused by the environment that you live in? But it's really difficult to tear these two things apart because most people live in environments with people that they are genetically related to. So that makes it quite difficult to tear apart, that to separate those ideas of that idea of genetics and the environment. So let's have a look at one way that we can have a look at how heritable a trait is. So this is a traditional way that people used to look at heritability. We don't really use it so much anymore because there are new ways of looking at heritability, but traditionally, twin studies were a really common way of looking at heritability. And so what we've got this fantastic opportunity that nature has offered us of identical twins and fraternal twins. So identical twins have 100% of the same genetics, some shared environment, but not 100% of the same environment. Of course, they have different experiences of life particularly as they get older. Whereas then we've got fraternal twins. So you can assume maybe that fraternal twins have a similar amount of shared environment. So a lot of their environment is shared, but not all of it. And they will only have 50% of the shared genetics, just like a normal set of siblings. But because they grow up at the same time and in the same sort of with the same parents and in the same environment, you can assume that this might be quite comparable. So what psychologists traditionally used as a measure of how heritable a trait is they would look at how similar identical twins are in a trait. How likely is it that if one twin is very agreeable, then the other twin is also very agreeable, or if one twin is very neurotic, then the other twin is very neurotic. So they would measure how much of that variation is shared between identical twins, and then they would also look at non-identical twins and see how much of that shared genetic how many of those how much of that variation is shared between fraternal twins. And then there are some complicated statistics that I won't go into that you can use to calculate about how much, what percentage of the variation is related to genetics. So this was the most commonly used technique for a long time when we were trying to answer this question of nature versus nurture. And according to lots of twin studies, there are loads out there, but most of them put most personality traits at about 50% heritable. So some of them are a bit more heritable than others. Some of them it's about 60%. Some of them are more like 30%. But it's a difficult question here because can we really separate the environment from genetics in these examples? Because these twins kind of grow up in the same environment, but it's not exactly the same. It's quite difficult for us to separate out that shared environment from the non-shared environment. So there's another way that psychologists would traditionally try to understand that difference between genetics and the environment. I wonder if anyone's got a guess as to what we use, what's something that happens anyway that we can study to try and understand a little bit more. You can write it in the chat if you have any ideas. Oh, we've got a question. Would this be similar for triplets? I don't think there are many studies that look at triplets just because it's less common, but yeah, you could definitely look at triplets. And yeah, if anyone's got any ideas about what it is that we use that happens anyway to understand heritability, to understand genetics, any ideas? If not, I'll just move on to the next slide. So if you can think about that. So something else that we use that happens anyway is adoption. So adoption is a fantastic opportunity to study heritability, to study genetics, because what you can look at this child who is growing up with a family who don't share that much genetic information with them. And what you can do is you can compare, you can say, is this child more similar to their adopted family, or are they more similar to their biological family? So there are lots of studies that have looked at this as well. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at heritability. So when you look at these adopted children, there's a study this 1998 study that found that children who have been adopted have very, very small correlations in personality traits with their biological families. So if you look at their biological families, they're not very likely to have the same traits as these children once they're adopted out to other families. So maybe this makes us think that personality is more due to the environment than it is to genetics. But there are also a lot of studies that have looked at how much adopted children have in common with their adoptee family. And they have a lot less in common with their adoptee family than they would than biological siblings would. So it depends on the study. Sometimes it's a little bit higher, sometimes it's a little bit less, but there also it's just because you're adopted by a family doesn't mean you'll have exactly the same traits. So what this kind of tells us is that we've got a lot of things going on here. It's not just genetics and it's not just the environment. So maybe it's the environment interacting with the genetics. But one thing that we can use these adoption and twin studies are how we would traditionally have looked at heritability. More recently, we can look at genomic data. So we can take samples of people's genetic information and we can get them all to do it. So in this study, they took 5,011 adults from different European countries. They asked them to complete personality questionnaires, and they also took samples of their genes, and they wanted to look at how heritable these different traits were. And what they found was that neuroticism seemed to be so 15% of the variation in neuroticism across these 5,011 European adults across different European countries so 15% of this variation was accounted for by some sort of similar genes across this population, and 21% of the variation in openness was accounted for by genes. However, there didn't seem to be any significant heritability of extroversion, agreeableness, or conscientiousness. So I think this is quite interesting. So maybe it implies that there is some genetic contribution, but it's to do with your with the environment that you grow up in as well. And if we want to think back to that graph that I showed you, I'll just flick back to it right at the start here, looking at different cultures and how much different. So you see that there's a lot of difference here in how people from different parts of the world will rate themselves on all of these different measures. So you can see that, in some cultures, you're more likely to rate yourself as more open, and some you're more likely to rate yourself as more agreeable. So there is a lot that must be due to kind of the culture, the environment that you grow up in, that isn't just explained by genetics. And let's go back to here. So they obviously both have an important impact on our personality, but maybe it's that interaction that's more important. So there's this really interesting study from 2008, which found that when twins report that there's a lot of conflict in their family, then genetics is less important. So in these situations, fraternal twins were more similar to each other because the environment, maybe their shared environment, had a bigger role on their personality. Whereas on the other hand, when twins believed that their parents had high regard for them, the role of genetics was more important. So the environment seemed to be less important and the role of genetics is more important. So this just kind of shows that it's not just the environment, it's not just genetics, it's both of these factors working together and interacting with each other. So let's move on to another key question in personality, which is, does personality change across the lifespan? So I don't know if you remember from that that quote that that definition that I gave you at the start of what personality is. And we had that word enduring. I think it was the word enduring in there. So it's enduring traits. So if a trait, excuse me, if a trait is enduring, does that mean that it doesn't change at all? Or does that mean that it's similar across the lifespan? So we've got this big question here. Can your personality change? Does it change? And what does it change in response to? And there are a couple of different ways that psychologists will try to answer this question. So one of the ways that we test it is longitudinal research, which means that you take one person, or well, you take multiple people, and you test them when they're age, I don't know, when they're age 10, then when they're age 15, then when they're age 20, then when they're age 25, or maybe you take the same people and you test them when they're 12, and then you test them when they're 73, which is a really great way of kind of, you take away that variation between different people. You know that you're testing the same people, but it's expensive because you have to keep following up the same people. Sometimes people will just not reply to your emails anymore, or they'll move house. They can be difficult to follow up. And of course, if you want us to follow people up across their whole lifespan, you have to wait. If you want to test somebody when they're 10 and then test them again when they're 70, you have to wait 60 years. So it's not always the most feasible way to look at how personality develops. Another way of looking is cross-sectional research. And so that means that you take different groups of people at different ages and you compare how their traits, how they compare across these different age groups. So these are the two main ways that we can look about changes, age-related changes. So I'll quickly just show you how each of these traits tend to develop across this across a large population. Again, I don't have the numbers here, but this was from a review paper. This is just across lots of papers. How do these traits change? These traits tend to change. So you tend to get, an increase in conscientiousness until during early adulthood, and then it kind of levels out across until you get to throughout your later adulthood. Then openness, you tend to be more open when you're younger, open to new experiences, and less open to new experiences when you're older. Maybe that makes sense. If you think about, I don't know, I know my grandparents aren't always open to going out and doing new things. They prefer to stay at home. Maybe they've already had their time being open to new experiences. Neuroticism, so emotional stability is the same as neuroticism. It's just two words for the same measure, and it tends to be relatively stable, although I think there are other papers that show that it reduces a bit when you get older. And people tend to get more agreeable as they get older, which I think is a nice finding, that the more experience we have with life, the more agreeable we become, the more kind of the nicer we become. So these are just some other studies that have found kind of how personality changes over the lifespan and what it changes in relation to. So as we saw in that diagram, so conscientiousness tends to increase until about middle age, and then there are also findings that it decreases after retirement. So maybe while you're working, your conscientiousness increases, but then when you don't have to work anymore, maybe that conscientiousness decreases because you don't have to focus on it anymore. There's some interesting other findings here. So across lots of different across large populations of people, it's been found that having a first romantic relationship is linked to increases in emotional stability, so that's a decrease in neuroticism, and increases in extroversion. Another finding that's found across lots of studies is that transitioning from school to college or work or university is associated with increases in agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, and decreases in neuroticism. So that's kind of, I mean, I know that you're all in year 10 right now, aren't you? So it's probably not what you want to hear, that you're not at your most agreeable or at your most conscientious or open, but maybe that's something that some people's parents might agree with. But you know, this is across large populations here. And personality changes are common after other life events, so trauma or the birth of a child. But these changes are a bit more complex, so different people might respond in different ways to these sorts of events. You see, some people become higher in neuroticism after a trauma, but some people might not. And let's just talk a little bit about adolescence and young adulthood. So this is a study, again, it was that same study that I referred to before, where they followed up these adolescents at age 12, 17, and then at 29. And they asked these young people to rate how to do personality questionnaires on themselves, and they also asked their parents to rate their personality. And they found that there was generally quite a lot of agreement between how young people and their parents rated their personality. You can see that there were significant increases in openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness across all the groups. Maybe people report a little less of an increase in openness compared to their parents. You can see that parents reported that young people had a decrease in neuroticism, but maybe young people don't report that themselves. They report kind of a steady level of neuroticism. So maybe if you think you're an emotional, anxious person when you're 12, you still think you're an emotional, anxious person when you're 29, but your parents may think that you're more emotional and anxious at age 12 than you rate yourself as being. And they rate you as kind of less emotional and anxious as you get older. And there wasn't an overall change in extroversion. Young people kind of report themselves to be a little bit more extroverted at age 17 and a little bit less at 29, but their parents report the opposite. So I thought this might be quite interesting for you as you're kind of in this age bracket. I wonder if you can see any of these changes in yourselves as well. And this is another study looking at kind of looking at adulthood, so a little bit later. So in this study, it was a really large study with more than 6,000 American adults aged 20 to 75 who filled in personality questionnaires with 9 years in between the two questionnaires. So it's a combined approach of cross-sectional research where you have people across different ages and longitudinal research where you measure the same person on two different occasions. They also looked at Japanese adults. They got just over 1,000 Japanese adults aged 30 to 79 to fill in personality questionnaires on two occasions with a 4-year gap in between. And I think it's quite interesting. This is just the different measures here, and I think it's quite interesting to see that on nearly every measure, the only measure that Americans don't rate themselves as being more than Japanese people is neuroticism, which seems to be relatively equal. You can see that Americans rate themselves as having this kind of increase in extroversion, kind of increasing in extroversion until around the age of 60, then it really drops off in older age, whereas Japanese people seem to report a general decrease in extroversion. Agreeableness, we've got that finding that you find in lots of studies, that people become more agreeable the older they are, but you can see all of these little lines on the graph related to kind of how individual people responded. So you can see there's a lot of individual variation there as well. Conscientiousness, as we found in previous studies, people become more conscientious throughout adulthood, and then it kind of drops off in later adulthood around the age of retirement. But Japanese people seem to become even more conscientious, increasingly conscientious throughout their life. And then we've got openness, which seems to drop off towards the end of towards later life. Openness to experience, so maybe you're less open to new experiences, less flexible in your thinking later on in life, and that maybe is certainly something I can recognize in my own family members. Maybe it's something you can recognize in some of your family members as well. Actually, so just this question, is personality stable over the lifespan? So are people who are more extroverted when they are 20 still more extroverted on average at age 60? So there've been lots of studies that have looked at this, and it looks like personality on the whole becomes more stable around the age of 30. Up until then, there is, there's more variation in and there's more likelihood that something will happen in your life that changes your personality. But there are still relatively high correlations between self-rated personality during adolescence and adulthood. And it becomes more stable throughout adulthood. So from about 30 to 60, your personality seems to be relatively stable, and then it maybe becomes a bit less stable after the age of 60. So there was a great study here where 1,208 children were rated on personality by their teachers when they were 14 in 1947. And in 2012, they decided to follow up with these same children. But unfortunately, they were only able to follow up with 174 of the children because, there are so many reasons why it's hard to follow up with children after so much time. And some of them might have moved away, some of them might have died. There are all sorts of reasons why you might not be able to follow up with them. And they found that conscientiousness was relatively stable, which is really surprising that any traits are stable between age 14 and age 70. Sorry, doing the calculation in my head, but yeah, in your 70s anyway. But other traits weren't so stable. So I think that's quite interesting there. So what can we conclude from what we've looked at here? So personality is that's it. So personality is complex and difficult to measure accurately. So you might have a different idea of your personality from your parents and from your friends. It's very difficult to know who is right there, what should we look at when we're looking at measures of personality. We can also use personality to predict a number of life outcomes, looking at things like how much money you might make when you're older, your academic achievement, your relationships, your depression. There are lots of other studies that look at how personality can predict different life outcomes. And what causes these differences in personality is a combination of genetics and the environment. Some studies suggest that genetics are more important. Some suggest that the environment is more important. But I think that what we can be quite sure of is that both have a role. And personality changes in some systematic ways as we become older. So maybe we become more agreeable. We become more conscientious until we retire. But there is some stability in personality traits compared between different individuals. So if you are a more agreeable person when you are 15, you're probably still going to be a more agreeable person when you're 25 and when you're 35 and when you're 70. But there may be some differences there. So that so now if anybody has any questions, so that's everything that's the end of this kind of example lecture. If anybody has any questions, it would be great if you could pop them in the chat and I'll see what I can get to. So if you have questions about kind of personality, or if you have questions about studying psychology, what psychology is about, or the things you can go on to do with psychology, then please pop your questions in the chat. So thank you. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Well, actually, stop sharing my screen for now. So let me know and I'll see if there are any questions. Oh, yes. So I've got a question here. What careers could this get you into? So what careers can studying psychology get you into? So there are lots of careers. So psychology is quite a nice degree in that it doesn't kind of close many doors. So there are lots of doors that will be open to you after studying psychology. You could go on to do something directly related to psychology, something like clinical psychology or counseling or becoming an educational psychologist. But for many of these jobs, you would need to go on to do more studying after you finish your degree. So you might have to go on to do another course after you finish, or to become a clinical psychologist, you have to study for years and years and years, and it's very competitive, but that is one thing that you could do. You could also, so I'm a PhD student. I do research in psychology. That's one option that is directly linked. You can also, lots of people that study psychology go on to jobs in kind of in offices. You can work in kind of human resources, that sort of thing, or it doesn't really close many doors. You could work in policy, you could work for the government, you could go into education later on. It's quite a nice degree because it has that statistics element, and it also has the writing element. So you've got something to say in an interview, no matter what that interview is for. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers your question. So I've got a couple more questions here. So how does neurobiology link to psychology in terms of studying the brain? That's a very good question. So they are very linked. Psychology, there is more of a focus on how, so we do look at neurobiology as within psychology, but we don't go into as much detail, and we're more focused on how people behave, how people respond to situations. I mean, it depends on the area of psychology, how people develop. We're more interested in real life outcomes and how those link to what goes on in the brain. Neurobiology often gets very specific. Okay, you end up looking at the different kind of synapse pathways in the brain and how different chemicals react, cause different have different impacts on the brain. You go into a lot more detail on actually what happens within the brain. It's much more biological, and you might study brain cells, neurons by themselves as well. Other questions here? Oh, can studying psychology change your views of yourself as a person? That's a nice question. It's an interesting one. I think it definitely has an impact on, I think it depends who you are, of course, but I think it has an impact on how you see yourself and how you see people around you. I think it's quite positive. I find that I have a framework to look at kind of the behaviors of the people around me. And I can kind of, I think maybe it makes me more understanding as a person of what's going on around me. But I think it really depends on who you are. And maybe it does have an impact on how you view yourself as a person. You study a lot on, social psychology, personality, cognitive function, memory, and you can often make links to your own experiences. So maybe it would have an impact on how you view yourself. So another question here. Do you need to have studied sociology or other similar topics in order to study psychology in later education? It's a good question, and the answer is no, you don't have to have studied sociology. It probably helps if your school offers psychology, it probably helps to have studied psychology, but you don't have to study psychology in order to go on to study psychology later. I didn't do psychology for my A levels, but I did biology. I did biology, history, and French, and I ended up studying psychology. I couldn't say for certain. It will depend on different universities and what their rules are, but in most cases, I think you need to study a science or math subject in order to study psychology at university. It doesn't necessarily have to be psychology, but you will have to read up a little bit in order to write your personal statement. You'll need to have a little bit of an understanding of what psychology is about in order to write that personal statement. So do we have any other questions at all? Any other questions? Because I think Oh, we've seen there's a question further up here that somebody asked earlier. Is it possible for parental personalities or habits to be genetically transferred through offspring? So that comes back to that question that we were looking at of kind of genetics versus the environment. And yes, it definitely, I think most of us can probably recognize some of our parents' traits in ourselves. And you can recognize that maybe some of those traits get passed down, but it might be through genetics, it might be through your experiences of life, and it's quite difficult to tear those two things to remove those things from each other, which is why we look at kind of twin studies and adoption studies to answer that question. So I think if we don't have any other questions, I don't think we've got any other questions, so maybe we can finish there, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Rosemary.
Okay.
Am I? Not that I'm not anymore.
Oh, you're not muted anymore.
Cool. No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. That has been really, really interesting. We've lost quite a lot of people. I don't know what happened. Everyone just disappeared. I wonder if the schools had internet disconnection or something. But for those of you who are still here, I hope you've really enjoyed the program. I hope you found it really interesting. It's been fascinating to see the sort of quality of the questions and stuff as we go. And yeah, the recordings are online, and this one will be added to that collection. So if you want to look back and go through them later on, please feel free. But yeah, thank you all for your time. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Rosemary, for such an interesting session. And yeah, we think that we'll end things there. So thank you all, and hopefully see you all again at some point. Take care, everyone. Bye.